Welcome to Beyond the Surface. On our podcast, we highlight underrepresented voices in architecture. We'll humanize architects by uncovering who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez, representing Illinois Tech's student chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects. Today's episode is called Journey to Architecture with our guest, Jesus Jimenez. He recently graduated from Illinois Tech with a Master's of Architecture. Jesus is a veteran, father, designer, and a future architect. Today we'll discuss what got him into architecture and his path to IIT. Hi, Jesus. Thank you for being our first guest. How are you feeling today?
Oh, I'm feeling really good. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be your first guest, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I'm glad to have you here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Can you describe your earliest memory of architecture and how growing up in the 80s defined your identity?
Yeah, that's a good question. My earliest memories of architecture for me are somewhat simple. I mean, I grew up here in the city of Chicago. We have great architecture. And my earliest memories of it was, as a kid, I grew up on the north side, and I remember riding through the city of Chicago on my homemade bike. I call it a homemade bike because my friends and I, we weren't as well off as we would have liked to have been. So all of our bicycles were basically, you'd find a frame in the alley, and then the next month you kept looking and you'd find 2 tires somewhere and a seat. And we built these bicycles. Once we had them built, the city was open to us. So we rode around. We would drive to, ride to downtown Chicago. We'd ride along the lakefront. And I remember, looking at these skyscrapers and thinking, wow, they're amazing. Looking at the older buildings, the Chicago Cultural Center, buildings of that statute, and saying, actually thinking as a kid, wow, who made these? How did they get here? I didn't know what an architect was, but I fell in love with it. I knew. And by the time I was 12, I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be an architect, and I wanted to do what I had seen, riding around the city. And, this was the 80s, and the 80s, no cell phones. There were no laptops. There wasn't a computer in every single home. The internet, what was that? No one knew, really. It was only being used, I guess, by universities at that point. It wasn't made available to the public. And I say that because I was a kid of the 80s, I identify very strongly with, the kids in Stranger Things. I look at their bicycles. They were always riding around on their bikes. Yeah. That was me and my friends. But it wasn't in a suburban atmosphere like they were. Ours was a very, urban atmosphere. And I identified with, there's a new series called On My Block on Netflix.
I've heard of that one.
I identify with that one because they're Hispanic kids. Yeah. And they're in a Hispanic neighborhood. And the other thing was E.T. When they're riding around on their bicycles, my friends and I thought that was the coolest thing. And so growing up in the 80s, I would say we didn't have the technology that kids growing up today have, but we had great friendships. And those friendships are some of the most enduring that I would say I have, even if I haven't kept in contact with them. To me, those kids that I grew up with helped mold me, And if you're wondering what neighborhood it was in Chicago, it was right on the corner of Winchester and Dickens in Bucktown before Bucktown became what it is today, or became gentrified. Mm-hmm. It was actually the area that we lived in was heavily Hispanic, Mexican neighborhood, like 2 or 3 Puerto Rican families, and I identify as Puerto Rican. And so, yeah, that molded my earliest memories of architecture for me. So, the other thing is how to identify culturally to it is that, the world was small to me then. As big as the city of Chicago was, I only knew a few blocks of it. And I remember one of my earliest memories where I realized that the entire world isn't Puerto Rican and the entire world isn't Hispanic.
I understand that, yeah.
Yeah, and that was my first dinner at a non-Hispanic home. And I was in a food/culture shock because I had never seen Brussels sprouts. I had never seen broccoli. It was not a part of our diet. And when I asked what we were having for dinner, they said pork chops. And my response was, yeah, but what kind of rice? I mean, rice is a staple.
Who doesn't have rice?
Right, in our diet. And so I also remember they put applesauce next to my pork chops. And I'm thinking, what is this? And the pork chops were white. Ours has a sauce to it. There's some color associated with all of the meat that we eat. And so after about 15 or 20 minutes, I remember my friend Mark, his mom, saying, "Hey, Susie, if you don't like it, you don't really have to eat it." And I said, "Thank you very much." And that's when I realized, like, wow, not everyone eats like us, because every other home I had been to was a Hispanic home.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if you're Mexican, Puerto Rican, Honduran, whatever, our culture and our appetites are very closely related. So that was my first big shock that, okay, not everyone does it the way we do. Also, growing up in the 80s, the other thing that shocked me was, and molded me quite heavily, was around 5th grade, I started getting teased a lot at school, and it was because of my accent. Now I was exposed to more white students, and so they picked on me because of my accent. And being young, you're able to pick up very easily on things like an accent or a sound. Young kids are good mimics, and that's what I did. I became a good mimic, and I started mimicking the way they would speak to lose my accent. Mm-hmm. You want to fit in. So I had to start erasing. It felt like I was erasing part of who I am. But the problem is, I'd hang out in their neighborhoods and speak like them. I'd come back to my neighborhood. I had to speak like me and the other kids. And so the big problem was that when I'd go to my other friend's neighborhood, 5 or 6 blocks away, I was too ethnic. And then when I came back to my neighborhood, I was trying to be white, is exactly what they would say. Why are you trying to sound like a white guy?
It was like a cultural shock.
Yeah, so it's like you don't know where you fit in. And culturally, I would say that's very significant, especially at a young age. You're being molded, by your environment, by the people around you, by what you see, imagery and things like that. So, culturally that had a big impact on me, because I continued to do it, not just growing up, but even as an adult. You wind up doing that kind of thing.
You mentioned you also always wanted to become an architect, but after high school, you ended up taking a different path. Can you tell us about the experiences and setbacks and how that influenced who you are now?
I like I said, I've always said it. It's about the age of 12, I knew that I wanted to be an architect very early on. I specifically chose a high school that I went to because I knew they had a drafting program. I didn't really know what drafting was. All I know is that when architects were drawing by hand and using these instruments that they use, scale, 45, 30-degree angle pieces and so forth, that was considered drafting. I had found that out. And so I went to a vocational high school here in Chicago. It was called Prosser Vocational, and I majored in drafting. So I took drafting all 4 years. And then my final 2 years, half of my day was spent in a classroom doing nothing but hand drawing, machine drafting. And that was also my introduction to the software that, all architects use, known as AutoCAD. I remember we had, technology was different. So your screen had one color, and your screen was either green or orange. And it depended on the monitor. You couldn't choose between green or orange. It just either came green or it came orange. Mm-hmm. And entering commands and so forth was completely different. DOS was still early. We didn't have DOS commands. You had one point of reference for the entire drawing, things like that. But I still knew that this was somewhat of a path for me to architecture, this education that I was receiving. But the one thing that kept burning in the back of my mind was college was not a reality for me. There was no way I was going to afford to possibly go to school. I had no idea what the costs of going to college were. No one at the school really sat you down and said, these are the steps to go to college and so forth.
Like no one prepared you.
Yeah, and it was a vocational school. So they were preparing us to go right into the workforce. Our thing was, I was a drafting major. I drew machined parts. And so I knew pen and ink. I drew on Mylar, things like that. And I know if you're not an architect, you're probably not understanding what I'm saying. But this was the cusp of hand drawing versus computer drawing. Computer drawing was coming in, and it was going to be the next big thing, right? But that's what we were being prepared for, to go out into the workforce. And so I did a lot of it on my own, investigating on my own, and what I could find. And again, you're going to the library, you're looking up resources. There wasn't an internet that I could use, but I knew it was expensive. And in my neighborhood, we didn't have kids that went away to college and came back or anything. It was a very rare thing. It's an immigrant neighborhood, and your parents wanted you to go get a job, have some security and so forth. There wasn't security in going to college, as it was viewed upon. I'm proud of my parents, very proud of them. My mom, 6th grade education, my dad, high school. They couldn't share with me, this is how you go to school. This is what you need to do. This is how you get a career. For them, career was one thing, job was another. So in high school, and I remember these dates clearly because, and they tell you, they kind of define you when you're in the military. So March 21st, while I was still a senior in high school, I enlisted in the Marine Corps. And I went in there telling them, I just want to see what you have to offer. I'm not going to sign anything. And that same day I left with a contract in my hand. I had enlisted.
Impressive.
Yes, I was going away. My date for a boot camp was still to be determined a little bit, but I made it clear. I said, I wanted my summer. I didn't want to go right after graduation, as I've heard some kids would do, but I enlisted. Went home, told my parents. They were like, no, you can't enlist because we have to sign for you. And I remember being really harsh to my mom and telling her, well, Mom, I don't need your signature because I'm 18 and I can go on my own. And so that's what, that was, to me, that was going to be a path. And that's why I signed. The Marine Corps painted a picture where, you give us service, we'll give you the funds to go to school. And also, as part of my military experience, it comes back to my neighborhood again. They kind of influenced what job I had picked. Here I know I wanted to go to school. I wanted to be an architect, but I didn't want the career that was even remotely related to that when I was in the military. I specifically told them, if I'm going to join the Marines, I want to learn how to fight. And the reason was because, growing up in my neighborhood, one of the incidents that really framed me happened right before I went into high school. It was a horrible summer because one of the gangs in Chicago had gathered myself and my friends. We're all under the age of 14. We're 13, 12-year-olds. And they explained to us that we're going to become junior Latin Kings. That was the gang, right? And we're going to be used to carry their guns and their drugs because if we get caught, it's a misdemeanor. You got to remember, this is 1984, around that time.
Yeah.
Laws were a little bit different. And they were going to do what's known as jumping you in. Basically, they were going to beat us up. And now you're in the gang, right? And, we're young kids, and these guys are all 18 years old and so forth like that. They're grown men to us. And we were horrified. And when they said who was next, I remember the first kid that went, and I never forget his name, but I said it was going to be me. And they said, oh, we thought you were going to be last. I had experience with this guy already in the neighborhood. He wasn't just bullying us. He was like traumatizing some of the kids in the neighborhood with the things he would do. And he said, I thought you were going to be last. I thought you were going to be the hardest guy to get into this group. And I said, no, I'm next, but I'm not joining. And so I'll speed it up and just say I told him, he goes, we're going to beat you even harder. And I explained to him, I said, that's okay. He goes, you really think you're going to take all 4 of us? And I said, no. I said, I can't take all 4 of you. So I'm only going to swing at you because that was the only, in my head, that was the only power I had was take him on. You're not going to take all these 4 guys on, so take on the leader, And in doing so, one of the kids stood behind me and he said, if Jesus isn't joining, I'm not joining either. And then all 10 of us stood there looking at these 4 men and we said, none of us are joining. So if you want, you have to, take us on right now. And they backed off, but he backed off very strongly. He put his finger on my forehead and he tells me this is not over and they're going to get me. And a couple of days later, I'm walking home from school and I realize I'm walking by myself And out of nowhere, in between some parked cars, someone comes and picks me up and throws me between the gangway. And in Chicago, the gangway is that space in between two buildings, 2, 3 flats. We call that a gangway here. And to give you a picture of who I was physically, for my 8th grade graduation, I measured 4 feet 8 inches for my cap and gown. I wasn't even 5 feet tall, barely weighed 100 pounds. These guys literally picked me up and threw me in there, and they took turns beating me severely. And so it was a bad beating because afterwards my ribs were all black and blue. I was spitting up blood. And my friends kept telling me, especially my best friend, Angel at the time, is telling me I had to tell my parents. And I knew I couldn't because I knew what the repercussions. I had 2 older brothers. I knew what they were going to want to do if they found out. So for the next couple of weeks, I made sure no one saw me undressed, no one saw me changing. I mean, looking back now as an adult, I might have had internal bleeding, but that really shaped me. And then I would say there's only one thank you that I would give that person who gave me that beating was they taught me how to be ruthless. And I kind of needed that in the military. It would come back to help me in combat. But the next time I saw him, he's laughing, asking me how I'm feeling. And out of nowhere, I made a fist and I hit him so hard that the blood just comes gushing out of his nose. And I should. Yeah, and I know they tell you violence doesn't solve anything or nowadays, and use your words. You don't use your words in that neighborhood like that. There were no words that I could give him, I thought. So I retaliated the best way I thought, and I told myself, if this individual gets up, Jesus, he's going to beat you so hard. You cannot let him get up. So I was ruthless, and he ran away because he was. I had hurt him pretty bad, and then the next time he saw me, he gave me a great beating, and this happened all summer. We went back and forth, him beating me and me thinking that I'm standing up to the bully. But the way this relates back to the Marine Corps was, I told myself no one was ever going to do that to me again. So not only was I going there to the Marines to go to college, I was going there to strengthen myself as a man. That's what I identified as. I need to be able to defend myself. And I never shared this with anyone, my wife, my kids. This came up a couple of years ago when at a family dinner, sister-in-law asked me, why did I join? And it just came to me, and I told her this story. And my brothers, my sister, none of them could believe that we were living in the same household, but I was having this experience, and they weren't. My experience was completely different. So that really shaped me a lot as to my military choices. And then my military choices would come to shape me in so many different ways.
I do want to say one thing. You're very strong. Even though I'm pretty sure that experience made you feel so powerless at first when you were younger, but the way you stood up to them and told them that no matter how much you beat me, I'm not going to join. That takes a lot of courage. And I feel like that's also why in the Marines, it helped you a lot because you already had the courage. So you just needed the physical strength. Yeah. You later joined the National Guard. So can you explain what you expected and how things turned out when that happened?
Yeah. Okay. So my trip to the National Guard was, I just have to go back a little bit and explain now that I had gotten my foot in the door. I was working at an architectural firm here in Chicago. I had completed an associate's degree at the City Colleges of Chicago. And here I was now wearing many different hats. I was now in the Marine Corps Reserves. And this is before joining the National Guard, but I was in the Marine Corps Reserves. I was studying architecture, working at an architectural firm. I was married. I had 2 kids, had an apartment back in the neighborhood where I grew up in, right there on Winchester and Dickens. The landlord even knew me when we went to apply for the apartment. He recognized me as one of the kids that used to run around the neighborhood. So there I was working, but I was still incomplete because I didn't have my bachelor's degree in architecture like everyone else in the office did who had either a bachelor's or a master's. I was a senior associate at the firm. I had been there close to about, I think at this point, maybe 7.5, 8.5 years. And I didn't feel equal to everyone else there. I placed so much on the education portion of it myself personally. And so I always wanted to go back, finish that degree. And I'm at Humboldt Park here in Chicago at the Puerto Rican festival that's held there every year. There's a National Guard booth. I go and I just wanted to see. They had some cool stuff on display, and I had been out of the military now for 10 years. That's how long I had been out. I had been out for 10 years. And I was a combat veteran because in the Marines, I participated in the 91 Gulf War as an infantryman. And so I remember we rode in to liberate Kuwait and so forth. So I had that combat experience behind me. And so I speak to someone, they're a recruiter, obviously. This whole event was just for this tent that they had, and the display was for recruiting purposes. And so I explained to them that I had already served and so forth, and he just pegged it. He said, "What about education?" He goes, what do you have? And I explained to him what I do. I don't have my bachelor's degree. And he said, "What if we paid for that bachelor's and let you finish college?" And I explained to him, I said, "I don't think I qualify. National Guard is different. You can, after 6 months of being in the Guard, you can go to any state school and we will pay for it completely as long as you're actively drilling and participating in the National Guard." And so in August, I went to his office, and in August of 2003, I re-enlisted in the National Guard, but I picked a unit that had never been activated for anything. I mean, not even a flood had they ever been called up to, and thinking I would be safe. And the reason I said safe was because I had kind of seen what was happening in Iraq. This was early on, in the invasion of Iraq was about to happen, and, the unsettling and unrest was there. So I'll be honest, I did not want to go back to combat. So my architectural experience, the fact that I drew electrical schematics and things like that, and I could read them, got me a position. I was supposed to be a generator mechanic, electrical generator mechanic. And but that was August. November rolls around. No one's called me. And I called them because I was worried. And I called them and I said, I'm Sergeant Jimenez, and you guys haven't called me. I enlisted in August. I'm thinking that I am what the Army calls AWOL, absent without leave. I don't know, Sergeant Jimenez, you're not. Why don't you come down this weekend? We're having a drill, and we'll explain everything to you. Just bring all your paperwork. And so what happened was I go there, and I'm Sergeant Jimenez, reporting as ordered. And by doing so, I did what's known as I activated myself. In a way, they couldn't touch me because I was like a recruit, basically. That's why they hadn't contacted me, because I asked them, I said, this place is like a ghost town. Where's everyone at? I didn't see anyone walking around or anything, but there were tons of vehicles in the parking lot. And they tell me, "Oh, the captain's on the drill deck. He's breaking the news to everyone." And I said, "Oh, what news is that?" And she says, "Oh, we've just been activated." And I said, "Wait a minute."
That's like the worst.
Yes, and I knew what it was. I said, "Excuse me." I said, "I'd like that paperwork back." I said, No. I said, "I am not." I said, "I've been in combat. It's not nice. I don't want to go back. I don't want to be there. Can I have that back?" No. Just go out to the drill deck, and we'll assign you a platoon, and we'll take care of everything." That was my first day, and that night I get on a bus, and they send me to Marseilles, Illinois. And it's funny because there's a Chicago architecture firm that designed this, redid this base, and they start processing me to go to Iraq. We didn't know the exact destination, but we were all pretty sure where we were going. And again, this was different. I'd been out for 10 years. They asked me, "What's my email address?" I explained to them, "Hey, my email address is so-and-so." And they're like, No, your military email address. I'm like, "What do you mean?" "The email address you were issued." I said, "Issued?" I'd never been issued anything. So we have a discussion, the guy and I, and then he also asked me, "You never had one?" I said, "No, I've been out for 10 years. That didn't exist." He also says, "Where's your uniform?" And I said, "It's my first day." And those words I repeated, I kid you not, at least a dozen times, because the way they set it up is, here you go and you do your email. Here you go, you do your will. Here you go, review your health insurance. Here you review your pay. Here you review your housing. And at every table, when I'd stand there, they go, "Sergeant, where's your uniform?" And I would repeat it, "It's my first day." And they couldn't believe it. And my file was like pretty much blank. I had a recruiter's packet. And so finally at one of the stations, this is the one that really kicked me in the gut, because they explained to me, I signed up for a special program called Try the Guard for 1 year. That clock started ticking in August when I signed the contract. It's now November. And I did that because the recruiter said Marines don't function well in the National Guard. You guys are very strict, very disciplined. The National Guard is run like a corporation, almost like a big business. And the structure that you're used to is not there. And I don't want to set you up to fail. And so they tell me they don't have enough time to deploy me anywhere because I need at least 1 year left on my contract. So they wanted me to sign what's called an involuntary extension. So I looked at her and I said, so if I don't sign this, you can't send me away? She goes, well, no, you don't have enough time. And I said, then I'm not signing it. And then she crossed out my name. She signs her name. And she said, soldier refuses to sign. And she had specifically asked me, do you refuse to sign this? And I go, yes, I refuse to sign. And then she gives it back to me with her signature on it and says, here you go, Sergeant. You've been extended for 1.5 years. So
it's like
you're off
the
to
worst case scenario.
Yeah. And I said, wait a minute. This is America. I go, you can't sign a contract for me and enforce it upon me. And she says, oh, yes, I can. And I said, oh, no, you can't. And I, using military jargon, I told her, I go, this is not my first time around the block. I said, I want a JAG officer. JAG officer is military jargon for Judge Advocate General, what we call an attorney. And she just raised her hand, pointed to some chairs that were lined up against the wall. There were all these officers there, captains and majors. And one of them walks over to me and he says, so Sergeant, you requested a lawyer? And I said, yes, I did. And they were just waiting there for legal problems. And he explains to me that they could do this to me. He literally said they could do this to me for the rest of my life. They're using a clause called stop loss clause. The military has to be kept at certain numbers during times of emergency. And since we were under presidential orders, they can extend me indefinitely as long as they have to. And so that's when I knew that I was going. The other thing, so we spent the night there, and the next morning, chow, what we call breakfast, we're in line, and a colonel walks in, and he tells everyone to stop, and he explains to us what's going on, that we're being activated. He's the final say-so, who goes, who doesn't, because there's rumors going around that there were soldiers that were untrained and yet they're going to be sent, possibly overseas. And he explained that the only experience you need is boot camp. It doesn't matter what your job is because your first job is an infantryman or a soldier, basic soldier. And so I knew that this guy, he makes the final decision, who goes where. And so I chase after him, and I remember asking him, I explained to him who I was, and he says to me, where's your uniform, Sergeant? And I said, sir, it's my first day. And he looks at me and he says, you're the one. And I said, excuse me, sir? And he goes, there were rumors about there's some guy here. This is his first day in the National Guard, and he's being deployed. He doesn't even have a uniform. And I said, yeah, that's me. So the talk was already there amongst the people processing us, And so I wanted a guarantee. I told them my Marine Corps job did not exist in the National Guard. I am a machine gun expert. 4 different types of machine guns. I can take them apart, put them together. I teach people how to use them. I know how to use it in several different ways to implement it in every manner possible. And that doesn't exist in the Army. So my fear was that I was going to get picked up by what we call a line unit, front line unit, a combat unit, and I wanted a non-combative role. So I asked him if he could guarantee me that I stay with this unit that I'm being deployed with, and he thought I had. He said I must have some really big, testes, testicles. That I've been told that, and so I asked him to shake on it that he would keep me there, which shocked him. And I told him, I said, you're a commissioned officer, I'm a non-commissioned officer. Can we just agree that I stay with this unit? And he told me, yeah. He said, I will keep you here with this unit. And, I go home, break the news to my wife. There was a lot of crying going on. I explained it to my kids who were, my daughter was in 6th grade. My son was about, I think, 3rd. But they knew what war was. They had seen a lot of movies or watched me watching a lot of war movies. And It was funny, we had just moved to the suburbs. We had been in our home about 3 months in Naperville, Illinois. We had left the city of Chicago, and hardwood flooring is still sitting on a pallet in the dining room because I had removed all the carpeting, we were going to fix up the house. And so a lot of that was put on hold. And then I remember going to the firm and having explained to them that I'm being deployed, my plans of going to school, joining NCAR, becoming licensed and so forth, were taking a weird approach or a weird path now. This was not in my journey that I had planned for myself into becoming a licensed architect. So the National Guard route was rough. So we got deployed in December of 2003, and I came back home about March 2005. So I spent about 14 months in an actual combat zone in Iraq. And we did convoy escort missions. So yeah, they fired upon us. And so, it was completely different than my first experience. I explained to people that when you leave the base over there this time in Iraq, it was the Wild West. Being on the road and so forth, there were people that wanted to harm us. And they wanted to harm you because you wore an American flag and because we had, basically invaded this country supposedly to help build it up.
Angry, yeah.
Yeah, and I actually I can relate to them because if someone did that here, I'm sure I would do the same thing, and I would feel the same way. So yeah, that was my endeavor, my trip, my journey into the National Guard.
And during your experience in Iraq, once you got home, how did you feel things had changed while you were away? And how did all that affect you?
Yeah, I got home and it was a big difference for me because I will say this, the military was very poor at that time in preparing a soldier to come back home from a combat zone. You would think that because of Vietnam that we had all these different experiences or all this experience, but they were going to be sending home a lot of people with PTSD and other issues. And I remember there's a longer story that I can't get into of how I almost didn't come home. Someone had to stay behind. I was the chosen one to stay behind for the unit. But I did get to come home with the entire unit. But the thing was that what I would say was the day we put all our bags on the plane to come back home, 3 instances where it's get on the plane, get off the plane. They're bombing the runway. They're trying to hit this big plane that's sitting on a runway in the middle of this military base. So it was on and off, and 24 hours later, you're home. And the experience for me was they landed us at a base in Wisconsin, and when I get off the plane, there's a group of other soldiers there, and they have these containers that I was not used to these, but they tell me, Sergeant, we need your weapon. And I took 3 steps back and I said, excuse me? I go, this is mine. And they said, no, you need to give us your weapon. And I said, no. I literally clutched it with 2 hands in front of me. And I said, this is mine. I had been sleeping with this machine gun. It's a M249 SAW. This thing can fire 700 rounds a minute. I always kept that gun and 600 rounds of ammunition strapped to my body every single day for the past safe. 14 months. And it was in my bed. I slept with it. And now they wanted to take it away from me. I was no longer a civilian. I was no longer the guy who worked at an architectural firm, the father of 2, the husband, the student. I was full-fledged soldier, a combat soldier. And here they are telling me to give up my 3rd arm, my lifeline. If anything went wrong, this weapon was going to save me. And that was my mentality. That's what I was trained to do. I had been in the military now. This is almost 12 years. And for 12 years, I was an infantryman. I don't fix things. I don't repair things. I don't do clerical work. For 12 years, I trained to fight. And then I trained others to fight. That was my role. That was my purpose. And now they're going to strip me of it instantly because I landed in the United States. And so I give it to them, and I'm looking back, and I am very distrustful of what's going on. And this is happening, and I look, and there's a crowd there. My wife and kids are waiting for me. They're standing behind a barricade. They're all cheering. And a lot of us, we felt like, where are we? The military did not explain this to us. Where are we? I'm back in the States and my family's there. How is this possible? And so it was a brief reunion with your family for a couple of hours, and the families had to leave. My family came back to Chicago from Wisconsin, and then we were there for 2 weeks, the processing, and they're giving us these quick classes. If you experience emotional discomfort, this and that, call this number. You're eligible for this, eligible for that. And that was it. Now we're back home, and it's very weird to me. Everyone's a civilian. Not a chip on my shoulder, but I was like, I'm a soldier. I just did, I was in combat for all this time. You guys know nothing. And the other thing was, I didn't go outside for close to 2 months. Wow. I was scared. I still remember driving home with my wife. It was weird. Being in a car was weird because when I was on the road in Iraq, I was always looking out for someone trying to shoot me or an explosive device on the side of the road. I was protecting a convoy of semi-trucks. We went over a bridge. You looked at that bridge because someone might throw a grenade over that bridge, or there might be an explosive set on that bridge. And it was just weird not to have that experience and to try to shut that off. And then a couple of months later, I go to the firm, and quickly it dawned on me. Within a week, I felt like the old new guy. I was only 35, but I felt older than everyone. Even the senior principals there and so forth, the founders of the firm, because I was 35, but I felt like I'd been through so much. These guys don't understand my life. I'm 35 and I've been to war twice. I was the only one really from Chicago at the firm, except for one other person. And they worked in the front of the office. And my experience was so different. And I was going through something that I didn't understand. I was very tired. I wasn't sleeping. Basically, I was going through PTSD. And I had no experience with this, no clue. And I remember the horrible thing that I did was I was at HPA in Chicago, Hartshorn Plunkett Architects, and Jim and Ray. I worked with them all the time, and I felt close with them. They take me out to lunch, and they really want to know how I'm doing. And they ask me, "Hey, Jesus, how are you? How are you doing?" And I felt like I was being questioned. The quality of my work was being questioned. My livelihood was being questioned. And I lashed out. And I said, "What do you want to know? That I'm not sleeping? That I'm having nightmares? That I sleep 3 hours a day on a good day?" I just rambled on like this. And I don't know if it was Ray or Jim, but everyone puts their hands on my hand and says, "No, we just want to know about you. How are you? We don't care about your work. We want to know how are you doing." And I still didn't take it that way. I was aggressive. And it was because I was always on guard.
You're on survival mode.
Yes, I think that's actually the best way to put it. I was still in survival mode. And my flight or fight mechanism took place, and I fought using words. And they were really concerned with me. But a couple of months later, I had made the decision I was going to leave the firm. I was going to leave architecture. I was going to leave what I loved most. Being an architect, I loved it. I loved all the projects, the things I did every day. And I went to work for a client. After that, I became a municipal inspector for 7 years. And that's when my PTSD got really bad. It was 2009. I wake up in a sweat, drenched. The nightmares now were uncontrollable. The things I was hearing, ringing noises. I actually thought I was going insane, and I had no control of my emotions. And I'm sitting there literally in my government vehicle, and I am in tears. I don't know why I'm crying. And luckily, a public bus passes by with this advertisement that it takes the strength of a soldier or something to ask for help, with a 1-800 number to call the VA. And I call them and I explain to them. And I'm in tears as I'm speaking to these people, and they tell me, "We can help you." And they set me up, and I go in. And it's at least a year before I tell anyone that I'm seeing someone at the VA, that I am going through what I'm going through. My job is suffering. I am coming in late. I am not completing tasks as required. And finally, when I tell them what I'm going through, my supervisor was great because he says, "Okay," he goes, "because the guy that we hired is not sitting here right now." He goes, "I don't know what's been going on with you." And I had been reprimanded already for my performance. And I explained to them, I said, I can, if I sleep 3 hours a night, it's a good night. And what happens is I do this for about a month, and then I get to the point of exhaustion that I collapse it's a collapsed sleep. I'll sleep 16 hours. And it's just my body's so tired. And what no one else knew was I had developed my suicide plan, because I told myself, if I can't sleep, I'm going to go for the eternal sleep. And it took a lot of convincing because my religious beliefs said, you cannot do this, Jesus. Suicide is the last thing. It's not allowed. God's never going to forgive you if you commit suicide. But then I negotiated it with myself and said, he's going to have to. I can't do this. And I finally told my psychiatrist at the VA that I've been lying to him for 2 years. I'd been in therapy for 2 years, and I was lying to this man, telling them more of what they wanted to hear than what was actually going on inside me. And he looked at me, and all of a sudden, armed people show up outside the office. And this is like the VA police. And he tells me that either I'm going down to up to the 5th floor, where they actually contain vets that are a danger to themselves. And I'm going to go into some extensive therapy, or because he knew I was married, I had a job and everything, he goes, I am going to commit to an extensive outpatient therapy where I saw a therapist twice a week. I saw him once a month, and then I saw a social worker also once a month. And I agreed to that because he said, if you go on the 5th floor, I don't know when you're getting out. But he said, right now you're a danger to yourself and to others. And he goes, if you don't want to go, he goes, these guys are here to make you go. And so I was like, wow, this is really coming home now. And so that was my experience from coming home from Iraq. And this went on for years. And I was always either very tired, mentally, physically, spiritually, or I was angry. I was angry because life went on without me when I was gone. And I saw that. And the person I owe the most to was my wife, because I thought, oh, life went on. She continued without me. She was able to function. But I didn't look at her point of view, the struggles. She was worried every night. Is my husband coming home? Am I going to be a widow? Am I going to be a single mom? And she was a single mom for that time because I wasn't here. There was nothing I could do. If there was any issues with our kids, discipline issues, whatever, school issues, I couldn't partake. The Little League games, I couldn't go. And when I saw how, when I got back, her and, her sisters and brothers, they helped her with a lot of things, and my family did too. And I took it as I've been replaced. All these people replaced me, and now I don't have a role, and most importantly, I didn't have a purpose within my own family. And so that's a lot to take in. And in the meantime, I have to function at these jobs. So because of my PTSD, I lost my job. There was an incident, a physical altercation. And after that, I bounced around job to job. So after I left the architectural firm, I was in construction management. I was a city inspector. I was a supervisor at UPS. I was a operations manager at another company. I worked for Home Depot. I drove a snowplow. What else? I Ubered for a while. And these are all the hats that I have worn after I came home from Iraq. And finally, the social worker and the CWT for veterans, it's cognitive work therapy, if I'm saying it correctly. She caught something. I had filled out questionnaires for a lot of different people. That's how they assess you when you have PTSD. And something she noticed was I wrote consistently. They ask you, when was I happiest? And on there I said, I was happiest when I was at HPA. And she said, what's HPA? And I said, I gave her the name of the firm here in Chicago. And she said, what did you do there? And I said, I was an architect. And she just looked so surprised. She said, you were an architect? And I said, yes. See, they didn't know me then. They knew me post-Iraq. Mm-hmm. They knew the city inspector, because that's when I went into treatment. And then they knew me as the guy who bounced around from all these jobs. I was exploding inside. And so they asked me, what do you need to do to get back to being an architect? And I said, that's not going to happen. That's not in the cards. I gave up on that dream. I said, I did it for 10 years. How many people can say they did what they loved for 10 years? I'm okay with that. And she said, no. She goes, if that's where you were happiest, let's get you back there. And I looked at her and I said, I need a master's degree. I said, I can't go back and just go back into architecture. No one's going to hire me. And to go back too, while I was an inspector, when I was working full-time, I went back to school full-time and completed my bachelor's, but it was in management. So yeah, I really was fighting. My education was really important to me. But now she says, we can get you back there. And my guard was up. And I specifically told her, I go, don't joke around like that. I said, that's not funny. I felt offended because that was my ultimate dream, my ultimate goal. And now you're just going to nonchalantly say, well, we can get you back there. I really didn't think I could get back here.
Didn't the National Guard say that they would let you go to whichever state school? What happened with that?
What happened with that was I had to be in the National Guard. So when I came back home, my contract was over. I would have to re-enlist. And there were a lot of reasons why I didn't. It wasn't that we might go to combat again or anything. It was because I couldn't get promoted. I was stuck at a sergeant level. And I didn't want that. The National Guard is not like the Marine Corps, where the Marine Corps has this thing, you can get promoted based on your experience. The National Guard, being like a corporation, again, schooling mattered. In order for me to get promoted in the role that I was, I'd have to go to a military school. And the career path that they wanted, I'd be gone again for about another year. And they did offer me a commission as an officer because I had 90 college credit hours at the time. And so the schooling from the National Guard wasn't going to be possible. But I did receive a letter from the federal government saying I was a combat veteran. There's a special GI Bill that just President Obama had established called the Post 9/11 GI Bill, and that I qualified. And that's what I used to complete my bachelor's, but in a different path. It wasn't architecture. I knew how architecture works. You got to be in studio, the long hours. I was married. I had a mortgage, 2 kids and a wife. Studio life is not something I could do.
Yeah.
So like I said, when they offered me the opportunity to get a master's degree, I was like, there's no way this is going to happen. But she went ahead and found the resources for me. And long story short, they said, okay, we'll pay for you to get your master's degree. And I was dumbfounded. I said, I don't know what to do. They said, well, number one, you have to get into school. They go, just because we're paying for it doesn't mean the school's going to accept you. You have to find a school and get in there. And I said, okay, that's not going to be easy. I haven't been in school in so long. Yeah. I graduated with my bachelor's in 2014. Here it was now, 2018. So what I did was I went back to the College of DuPage, a junior college here in the suburbs, DuPage County, because I wanted to get myself back into that studio mindset. I had not drawn in years, and they agreed to pay for that. And they also agreed through the program I would receive a stipend so that I could just focus on school and not really have to work. And that helped a lot. It was still a lot less than what I would be earning, but even at that time I really wasn't earning much because I was bouncing around from job to job. And so I went there, and it helped a lot to be around the architectural models, be drawing. And the 2 professors there, Mark Pearson and Jane, I believe your last name is Ostergaard. I'm sorry, Jane, if you're listening. But I don't know if they know what they did for me. It was good to get some praise on my work, but I don't think they knew too what my actual background was, because even then my PTSD would always come back. It was like, it just doesn't let you go. And I was still having the sleepless nights and so forth, and I didn't tell anyone there. I didn't know also, it was the VA that told me that with PTSD, you do have a learning disability because my brain functions differently, a little bit differently now. And I also had a TBI, traumatic brain injury from the concussions. And so what really dawned on me was my final project. My final project was on the lakefront of Chicago, and it was a big struggle for me because I avoided it because that was where I had determined I was going to commit suicide. And so here it is, my final project, and it's near the spot, near the Adler Planetarium. I was a lifeguard when I was a kid in the city of Chicago, like for 4 summers, and that was the spot I would walk, and that was one of the most serene spots for me in Chicago, was walking in between the Adler Planetarium and the Shedd Aquarium. And so my plan involved me just swimming out there and swimming till I couldn't swim back. And now we had to go visit it. And, it was nervous for me and everything, but I struggled and I completed it, and I completed it well. I did good praises and so forth. And I just kept wondering, this thing's always going to be there.
Yeah.
And at the VA, they made it clear to me, one of my breakthrough moments was when I remember telling them when I was going into the therapy, you said, I'm not going to sit around in a room with a bunch of people, discuss my feelings and all this other stuff. I'm not doing that. I said, I'll sit here, but I'm not going to talk. And I sat there for 2 months, going there once a week for 2 months, and I never spoke. And then finally I speak. I don't know what came over me, and it helped so much. I thought group therapy was like a joke, something you see on television. And then I remember, I did this group therapy, and I'm back in architecture school, and it's time for me to apply. And I remember I applied to IIT, a couple of other schools, and then I needed letters of recommendation. If you're applying to the master's program, you need 2 architects to give you a letter of recommendation. So I reached out to HPA, and I said, would it be possible to get a letter of recommendation? And I'm eternally grateful to Ray Hartshorn. He said yes. And so I meet with him, and it was funny because he takes me back to his office. Him and Jim share an office, right? They're the founders of the firm. And Jim's there. He says hello, and he gives me the greatest hello, such a welcoming hello. But I'm still there, kind of with my head down, because I felt ashamed of the way I left. I mean, I didn't leave on bad terms. I didn't leave on bad terms, but I felt like a prodigal son in the Bible coming back home. And then one of Jim's first questions was, he goes, "Hey, Jesus, how old are you?" And I looked at him and I said, "I'm 48. And he says, "You want to go back to architecture school at 48? And I said, yes. I didn't know how profound that was because I didn't have that experience. I'd never been to a major university studio. I was at the junior colleges, and it is different. Well, my first experience at the city colleges was different. College of DuPage, they have a really strict architectural program that relates very closely to here, what's at IIT. And I said, yeah. And he goes, okay. And he goes, but a master's? And I looked at both of them and I said, yeah, guys, I completed my bachelor's degree while I was working full-time as an inspector. And that was because they knew I didn't have my bachelor's when I was working for them. And so I get my letter of recommendation. A couple of months later, I remember the letter arrives. I'm home by myself. And I wanted to hold it until my wife got home, and I couldn't. I had to open it. IIT said I was accepted. And I cried. I was so happy I cried because I couldn't believe it. And then I'm pacing back and forth in my house, and I go outside, and I'm pacing back and forth. I'm trying to get a hold of my wife, but because of the where she works and how she works, it's sometimes extremely difficult. She works in like some hospital settings where cell phones don't really work and so forth. And a neighbor comes by, and she sees that I'm crying. She goes, "What's wrong, Jesus?" And I look at her and I said, "I got into grad school." And she goes, "Okay, that's nice." And I said, "I'm going to be an architect," And I was like, wow, I did it. I got myself here, because to me, I kept telling myself, all I need is a chance. If someone gets me in, I will do the rest. If I can get in, I can do the rest. I still had that I believed that I could do it, especially since I had finished at College of DuPage. They were nice in the fact that College of DuPage let me enroll into the advanced courses. They looked at my experience and like, we're not going to make this guy go through basic drafting courses and basic architectural courses. Yeah. They let me enroll in the advanced studio courses right away. And it did come back to me. The software came back to me. How to draw, how to hold your pencils, how to express yourself.
All nostalgia.
Yeah. Because, as architects, we express ourselves graphically very heavily into graphics more than written or even orally. And things like line weights came back, showing depth, perspectives, all that. I thought I had lost this, but it didn't.
Yeah. Congratulations on graduating. So now that you have completed everything at IIT, what's your future plans?
My future plans, most people are like, okay, I graduated college and I've got to go apply to these firms, get a job, and so forth. But for me, that's such a heavy question because to me, I'm looking at it, what are you going to do now for the rest of your life? And I'm not 24. I'm not 28. I'm not your average typical graduate. But if you look at my resume, I am, right? This guy just got his master's degree. Now he's looking at for a firm. And when you look at my resume ahead of my architectural experience, there's so many other positions that I've held, so, I'm trying to say that I'm more than what's on paper. I have a lot more to offer than what's on paper, than what's on the application portals for these companies. But my goal for me is still get into a firm, complete the AXP program for architects. That's our architectural experience program. You need to complete that. So you need to complete that for licensing requirements. Now that I've completed my education requirement, I really want my license, because then if I'm a licensed architect, I can claim the title of architect. We know that legally you can't say you're an architect unless you're licensed. And for me, gaining that license, now everything's come full circle. That 12-year-old boy has completed everything he wanted. And here I'm completing it at 52, going on 53, So that's a long trip, a long journey for someone to still keep going after what they really wanted. I could have quit a long time ago. I could have taken other jobs, but no, I'm still going. So now what I need is, I would say I need another break. I need someone to be willing to take a chance, give me an opportunity. And just like I said about IIT, I'll do the rest. I'll do the rest there too. I'm not looking for just a firm. I need to find a home again, my architectural home, and a place where I can grow. I'm looking to be, I want to be a principal at a firm. I want maybe even a partner, be offered a partnership at a firm. But for me right now, it's completing all the licensure requirements, the LEED certifications. As architects, if you're not an architect and you're listening, there are a lot of certifications that we have to get to really help you and to get you more experience, more talents that you need. Sustainability is something that really you can't design without looking at the sustainable approach of your projects and so forth. Energy efficiency and things like that. So LEED, sustainability requirements, all of the licensing requirements so that I can take the architectural exam and other types of certifications, joining other organizations as well to network, NOMAS, Arquitectos, the AIA, these are all professional affiliations I need to connect more with now. But that's my goal. I still can't believe that I've completed it. It seems...
Congratulations.
Yeah, it just seems... It was daunting. And, for those of you who know me, while I was at IIT, I also... The last year and a half was horrible for me because I experienced a lot of medical problems. And the last semester, I got long-term COVID, so that was a struggle to complete. And so that's why I didn't finish when I was expected to finish. And so in and out of the emergency room, I had 2 surgeries in my last year. And so now, physically, I'm great. Physically, I feel great. Mentally, I feel great. It's like I'm not waking up and pulling all-nighters and stuff anymore in the studio. I'm not sleeping on campus, So yeah, right now I'm applying at different firms and in different roles too, not just as an architectural designer. There's other roles that you can take. But I still haven't come full circle until I get licensed. That's when I think it won't be complete. As an architect, you've always got to grow. You've always got to improve yourself. You've always got to be willing to expand your way of thinking. And you've got to expand with the environment that you're in, the design approach that you've taken or that you take to complete your goals and your tasks. And that's where I'm at. But like I said, licensure now for me is the really, really big thing that I want to do. I want to be able to say, Jesus Jimenez, licensed architect.
I hope to hear that in the future. And hopefully we can always continue this conversation. I am so glad that you're here, and I'm very proud of you and how far you've come. Your story is very inspiring. So thank you for having this conversation with me.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. And like I said, if there's anyone out there who's wondering if they can make it, you can make it. That's why I was that's in a way, that's why I agreed to this, why I discuss my PTSD symptoms and so forth. If there's anyone out there going through the same thing, and not just military PTSD, any form of PTSD or mental health issues, it does help to talk to someone.
Yeah. I want to thank everyone who's listening. We release our episodes monthly. You can also find us on Spotify. I want to thank our producer, Caleb Kwok, and the WIIT team for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Surface featuring Jesus Jimenez. Until next time, goodbye.